Stephen Gardner is the CEO of Amtrak, America's National Railroad. I recently had the opportunity to go visit him in his offices in Washington, D.C. for today's podcast. I'm Paul Comfort, and on Transit Unplugged, we take you behind the scenes of transit agencies around the world and talk to their top executives. There's a lot to talk about during this visit with Stephen Gardner, where we met in his conference room. We talked about the record ridership last year of 32.8 million passengers, the new capital investments, $4.5 billion, and what they're doing with all that money, how they're doing things differently, bringing on the new Acela trains, and how they plan to continue to grow and double their ridership, hopefully, by 2040. We talk about the new services, the return of the Gulf Coast service, high-speed rail, their interactions with state agencies and supporting their services. Also, the Frederick Douglass Tunnel in Baltimore, where I used to serve as CEO of the MTA. I asked him about that. He has drawn on 2 decades of transportation policy experience, and he has taken Amtrak into kind of a new era of modernization, service expansion, and growth. Join us on today's episode of Transit Unplugged with my very special guest, Stephen Gardner, CEO of Amtrak. Great to have Stephen Gardner with us today on the podcast. He is the CEO of Amtrak, America's National Railroad. We're at your headquarters. Thanks for inviting us in, man.
Paul, great to be here. Thanks so much.
Yeah. So tell us some about yourself, how long you've had this role, and then we'll go into what's going on at Amtrak.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I am coming up just about here in a week, my 3rd anniversary here as CEO. Awesome. But I've been in the company since 2009.
Okay.
And actually started way back in 1993 as an intern, 92, 93 maybe. So have had a long history with the company and with railroads. I was a kid who loved anything big that moved, and found my way into railroads in high school as an interest and transportation generally. And then I've been working in both on the freight side and in passenger and in policy and regulation for my career, and been really lucky to be here at Amtrak during a pretty phenomenal time.
That is great. Like, who's your boss? Who do you report to? How did you get the job?
Yeah, so I work for our board of directors.
A board of directors.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, our board is interesting. They're appointed by presidents and confirmed by the Senate. So,
is that great?
Yep. And then there are 2 sort of statutory additions. The Secretary of Transportation is a board member, and obviously doesn't need to be confirmed separately for that role. And then the president and CEO, historically now the CEO, is also a member, but I'm an ex officio member, so
okay.
I don't vote, but I'm a party to all the proceedings. And
that's good. You should be.
Yeah, and I get to spend a lot of time with my bosses there.
That's great. So tell us about Amtrak. Explain to the listener in Saudi Arabia today.
Yeah.
Because we're heard in 100 countries. Tell us what Amtrak is and how you all function.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story, and pretty unique, right? Because the thing that really separates the U.S. rail system today from everywhere else in the world, and I get this question all the time. Like, how come our system's different than, in Asia or in Europe, right, is the private ownership of our nation's railway infrastructure.
Okay.
We, Canada, Australia are really the sort of big developed countries that have privately owned rail infrastructure. Really everywhere else, for the most part, the infrastructure is owned by the public sector. A lot of it came out of the world wars, frankly, when infrastructure was destroyed and rebuilt and became under public ownership. But so Amtrak is a unique entity. I like to describe this sometimes as kind of platypus-like, where we are a creature of the federal government, created by an act of Congress, obviously with the executive branch's support and approval, but we function and are a C corporation here in the District of Columbia. So we're structured like a normal private for-profit corporation.
Okay.
And we're chartered for a public mission, basically. The government created a company that could act kind of like a commercial entity and do all the things that commercial entities do, but for the purpose of benefiting the public. And so we have a board of directors that reflects really that ownership of the federal government in the asset, because the government created the corporation, and then the government actually owns us through preferred shares, which is, people don't necessarily know that we do have shares, and they're owned by the Secretary of Transportation, in essence, by the department.
Wow.
And so we're an asset of the federal government. We're not an agency.
Okay.
And there are a lot of reasons for that. It's interesting to think about the different ways that the government can structure entities to accomplish public missions. You can think about kind of an interesting alternative arrangement, which is sort of the FAA, which has a regulatory and policy arm, but then has a huge operating arm in the air traffic control system, right? 40-some thousand people who are out there making stuff happen every day. In the case of sort of federal railroad policy, Congress created an entity, Amtrak, sort of outside of the government, but supported by the government and owned by the government, and then has the Department of Transportation through the Federal Road Administration as regulator and policy and planning apparatus. So we're kind of one half of the federal policy and program for interstate passenger rail. And we were really created actually at the really recommendation and the behest of the private railways at the time, who were operating passenger trains and freight trains over their network. There were 20 or so Class 1 railroads, big railroads all over the U.S. at the time. A lot of sort of very significant financial risk that was and bankruptcy sort of either occurring or on the verge in the industry at the time, and a desire by the private railways to, in essence, consolidate the passenger operation and relationship into the federal government. And the exchange there was, in essence, the federal government would become the agent for the private railways to deliver on their common carriage obligation for passengers. So historically, the railways exist in part because they receive charters from the public to be able to operate their service and get easements and condemn property, all that kind of stuff, in exchange for agreeing to carry both goods and people. And that, all regulated by the Interstate Commerce Commission, eventually leads to this point where the federal government picks up that responsibility in essence. And in exchange for doing that, got access to the nation's rail network. So the tracks, facilities, the people for a while, in essence, to deliver on that service. So it's a unique entity. We're a national railway, but quite different than the national railways of other national railways, which own typically the infrastructure,
right,
and have a big, long, track record of development assets. We're a very small sort of owner of the asset that we use, 21,000 route miles, and across the 46 states that we serve, but we only own approximately 1,000 of those. Okay. So we're mostly a tenant on other people's railroads, essentially delivering kind of the obligation of serving passengers on behalf of the federal government using those assets in partnership with them. And then we own a big piece of railroad here in the Northeast and a couple of pieces across the nation, some for historic reasons, some for strategic reasons.
Now, you operate some direct, most of it directly, but we were just saying before I turned on the mic that when I was at MTA, I used to run under a contract the commuter train services, Maryland, into Union Station, and I think you operate the Penn line, right?
That's right.
So do you bid on that, and then?
Yeah, it's a great point. I like to think about our business in sort of two big buckets. First, one is that we have our transportation business, our passenger business. That's kind of like an airline, We have a retail business. We get out there, we have to market and advertise to customers. We have to create a pathway for them to purchase. We have to think about how we price and manage all that stuff. And then we have to deliver great customer experience on routes that make sense and that meet people's mobility needs. So that's kind of the business that most people think about when they think about Amtrak. Right. Kind of door to, station to station retail transportation operation. Inner city, right? And that's a really important point, right? Our basic purpose in life is to serve inner city markets and interstate commerce, right?
Yeah.
So we're serving, every 20 miles or 30 miles or 50 miles, not every 5.
Right.
And our routes tend to be longer than 100 miles. A commuter is in that space of sort of sub 100 miles, making stops that are much shorter and also really focused on sort of peak commute times, right? As opposed to us really different trip type for us. So we've got this kind of airline business a little bit. Obviously we like to think we offer a really different product than the airlines, but just in terms of the functions of what airline does, we have to do that too, right? And then we also have something kind of like an airport business, which is that we have all this infrastructure, particularly on the Northeast, that we use, but fundamentally we provide for a whole series of users. So on the Northeast Corridor, 8 different commuter railways, 4 different freight railways. In Chicago, we have Metra. So even though Amtrak has about 300 trains a day and about 33 million passengers a year, if you actually look at all the different entities that rely on our assets and services, it's more like 300 million trips a year, not 33 million trips a year. And it's way, way, way more than 300 trains. Just on the Northeast Corridor, it's about 2,200 trains a day.
Yeah.
So we're a minority user of the assets we own in the Northeast Corridor, and our job is to be sort of a steward there, like an airport. You've got a facility, it's got to work.
Yeah.
You've got all these different carriers.
Yeah.
They're trying to do their respective jobs. And so those are our kind of two big halves of the business. To your point, in that kind of passenger business, as opposed to sort of the infrastructure or terminal business, we both run our own trains, and then we also make ourselves available to run trains on behalf of other entities.
Yeah.
Sometimes in partnership, like in Winter Park, we're providing the ski train up to in Colorado from Denver. That's a sort of joint partnership between the resort and the city, or like Maryland MTA, who's been a fantastic customer and partner for us for forever, really, on the Penn Line. And those are opportunities for us where we think about where's the synergy. Where do we already have facilities and people, and it makes sense for us to be able to add some components here. We tend to think about our business in that way and think about risk and reward and time and energy. We can't do everything. We got to make sure our core business is working well, but then we try and augment and help where we can, because we want rail to grow. We believe in rail. We believe deeply that there's a huge opportunity to expand the use of our network. We have the largest rail network on Earth, any nation.
Really?
By far.
That's great.
It's a fact that folks don't really know about, right? I think we're 60,000 more route miles than China. So it's this huge network we have.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And there's so much, I think, latent capacity to move both passengers and people. And we're going to need it as we keep growing as a country.
Yeah.
So that's sort of in a nutshell. Those are the big things we do.
It's the only way to go in my mind, like for the Northeast Corridor. So I live on the Eastern Shore, Maryland. I'll go to Wilmington, hop on the train, pop up to New York on the business class and on the Acela, which doesn't stop as much. Boom. You can walk around. I hate airplanes now, how tight they are and how cramped in. And man, Amtrak does it right.
Yeah. Well, look, I love to hear that first and foremost. And look, that's why we're really bullish about the business, because in the end, I travel all over the U.S. Well, I don't ever meet anybody who says like, trains, those are sort of old days, like relics. Like who would ever want to ride a train? Like, I hear exactly the opposite exactly those reasons. We're I think of us as a more generous mode, a mode where
I like that.
It's a little more human, you can get
windows.
up. Yeah, bigger windows. You can get up, you can walk around, you got a little more space, you can go grab a bite.
You got food on there.
You can see some friends. And you get to engage with the landscape too, right?
Yes.
You get to, it's sort of not airline, look, and for sure, we know that the airline industry is essential, and we know that there are real places that, real trips that make sense by air. But it's a little bit like teleportation, you like get in a box and you show up somewhere, right? In trains, you get to experience the communities, you get to connect. I mean, I think it's just a generous experience comparatively.
That's a great way to put it.
So, I think we try to play that up. Obviously, we got a lot of old assets we're trying to make better. At the same time, we're trying to keep, as we make those assets new and modern and appeal to whole new generations, we're trying to keep the things that we think makes rail special and different. And people really like it. I also have to say, nobody seems to really enjoy driving these days.
That's right,
So there's also a huge group of people who are looking for an alternative than sitting in traffic or the stress of driving, and a whole new generation, frankly, who thinks driving is it's an imposition. It's kind of a waste of time. Like they want to be on their devices. They want to be doing other stuff. They don't want to be bothered with that. So, I mean, the good news is everywhere we look, we see people interested in the business. That doesn't mean rail makes sense everywhere. You know, certain markets make more sense than others, and the economics of the business are challenging. It's a lot of fixed cost, a lot of upfront cost to get a service going. But but there's way more opportunity than we've been able to tap yet.
We do a TV show, Transit Unplugged TV, and I want to one time do a cross-country ride on Amtrak and film it, man.
Yeah.
We might even do a documentary on it.
Yeah.
I mean, that'd be a phenomenal experience, interacting with everybody. Yeah. It's awesome. I'm sure you've had plenty of people do it. But
and I do. So I'm on my, I don't know, I've been on every route at least a couple times in my career.
Yeah.
And we go out and as a quarter, our executive team goes out and we visit parts of the network. And then myself and our president, Roger, we do trips, maybe 3 or 4 a year. We get out on the network, say hi to our customers, our employees, our facilities. And it's incredible what you see. I mean, these routes, whether it's our state-supported network, which are those shorter distance corridors that we operate in partnership with our states and the states fund and are really sort of, they drive that network, or our long-distance trains, you see really fascinating stories out there. And you see a lot of communities where we make a big difference. I was on the Texas Eagle last year. We showed up at Little Rock at like 3 a.m. It's 3 a.m.
Yeah.
Paul, and I always try and we shift sometimes of who does what, but we always try to make sure we sort of as leaders we're out there at those times so we can see customers, employees, and really see what's happening. And there were like 50 people waiting in line. This is a train going to Texas from Little Rock in 3 a.m.
3 in the morning.
Right?
Yeah.
And there's not one person or two people, but sort of 50 people getting ready to get on that train. And it just shows you how much, I think, more we could do in a city pair like that. Dallas to Little Rock. If there are 50 people willing to get up and take that train at 3 a.m., what would it be like if we could offer a train at 9 a.m. and at 3 p.m., right? So and the good news is we're really seeing this proved out, in fact. Our ridership is new record in 24. We're back above COVID. And I think we're the only entity you're going to be talking to in this transit space, that's really in that spot. I think buses come back in some places, and higher, but in terms of rail, we've got tons of demand and
record ridership, 32.8 million.
That's right. Yeah.
Dude, boom.
Yeah, and we're going to be better than that. Already, our first quarter was better than planned for 25, so we're doing
awesome.
well.
So, and record capital investment. Talk about that. You've had a lot of money come in here over the last few years.
Yeah, we have. So, it is exciting. It's incredibly exciting. And I think all of us at the company feel like we won the lottery. Like we're here at the time. We're here at the right time when we get to make investments. But on the other hand, the reason there is so much money coming is because for so long the company was starved.
Right.
So we inherited assets back in 1976, which is when we took over the Northeast Corridor, for instance. They were ready to be retired like 10 years prior or 20 years prior. And now we're 50 years later and we're still like keeping those things together, right? So it's a huge amount of investment happening in part because it's urgent that we start to recapitalize some of these old assets, equipment that's 50 years old.
Yeah.
If I showed up to your house with,
28 Studebaker.
Yeah, exactly. Like, how would you feel, right? You might think that was cool for a second, and then you'd have to think, like, I'm going to drive in that thing for 100 miles? I don't know, right?
Yeah.
So we have all this old equipment. We have these huge bridges and tunnels on the Northeast Corridor, as you know. And as you know, in Maryland.
Baltimore, the Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass.
Yeah.
There's a tunnel, 1871.
Yeah.
It's
Lincoln era, baby.
Yeah. It's Ulysses Grant, right? It's just like, it's obviously time to replace an asset like that was designed with a completely different concept, doesn't meet today's standards, isn't fit for purpose in terms of capacity or trip time or safety or any of those things. And it's not going to last forever,
I remember I sat in the front of one of your trains with the full glass.
Yeah, I remember that trip.
And we went on. Were you on that one? Yeah, that was cool, man.
Yeah, you really see up close and personal, and I think it speaks to you, right? You sort of see like, okay, I get it. I get that this is something that and so some of those big assets, it's like it's a binary choice. You either replace the thing or you don't run the railroad.
Yeah.
Right? It's like,
so what are you going to do there? Like, tell us about that, because a lot of people around here want to know about that.
Yeah. So we have this case. We actually have 3 separate tunnels that were built in the 1870s, as I said, and they make a big curve when you're coming into Baltimore. You're heading kind of northeast, and then you make a sharp right hand, and you basically go sort of due east across to the station, and then you make another turn. You end up heading north again. And those tunnels are where that curve is. And we end up having to go 30 miles an hour. And we have 2 trains in a single tunnel, which is not the right design. It's not a modern design. Nobody in the 20th century would do that, let alone 21st. Because if you have a problem with one of the trains, now you've impacted the whole tunnel, and you've impacted potentially other trains in there, right? And then there's water problems. There's a whole, I'll spare you the details, but there's a ton of groundwater and water from the municipal water system that gets in there and is sort of working negatively against the structure, which is all brick lined. And I mean, it's an incredible, I raised my glass to the folks who built it, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the predecessors that built it in the first place, because it's still there, but it's way time for retirement. So we're going to build a new tunnel. It's 2 separate bores that will go in a wider arc around kind of the current tunnel and show up at Penn Station, Baltimore. And that alignment is going to allow us to go a lot faster, so 100 miles an hour instead of 30.
Wow.
And it's going to meet all the proper standards. It's built so that eventually you could even add more tubes if you needed, so that in 2070 or whatever, when we need to grow again, there's a I think it's really important for me as, someone who was a planner here at Amtrak, and that our successors 40 years from now don't look back and go like, oh, those guys, right? So we tried to build everything thinking about future needs, right? And we're cognizant we're building assets that could last 200 years. So, how do we anticipate the needs and modularity, so to speak? So anyway, this new tunnel is going to really give us a great new approach into Baltimore. It'll allow future growth in the long term, and it gives us the proper fire, life safety, evacuation, ventilation needs to have a safe operation, which is what we owe at our first duty. Our first duty is always to operate a safe system,
safety,
and that's essential.
Right. Yeah, I used to close every meeting at the MTA. Now, we said what we're going to do today. What's the one thing we're not going to do? We're not going to have a derailment.
Yeah,
that's how I close every meeting. Yeah. How long before you think this thing is like, it takes a while?
Well, yeah, it takes a while. It's in the 2030s and early 2030s. We're working on, opportunities everywhere we can to sort of pull those in, but it takes a couple of years to order the big tunnel boring machines.
Right.
And then they got to go in there and they got to dig their holes.
Yeah.
So, but we're looking everywhere we can to try and shave time and, of course, make sure we got a safe asset. But we're as impatient as anybody,
of course,
to get the old thing replaced and get a new asset. And then speaking of Mark and your alma mater, the MTA gets huge benefits because they're our partner in this program. It's a partnership between Amtrak and Maryland.
Holly's doing a great job.
Absolutely. And together we're making investments here to match the federal investments. But Mark's going to be able to offer, almost basically 30-minute express service sort of downtown Baltimore to Washington, which
negates the need for the
huge, which is a huge asset.
That is big time.
Big time. Yeah. And I think it really changes sort of Baltimore's.
If you could go from Baltimore to Washington in 30 minutes, that's going to be loaded.
Right around, I think, 30, right? Yeah. So that's great, and it means that you're basically, and I think that's what rail can do, and intercity rail in particular. You can bring regions and cities closer together, and you create larger labor pools, larger economic opportunities, because people can live and work reasonably live and work across a larger physical distance because rail can shrink time.
That's right.
And I think
that should be your new logo or motto. Rail can shrink time. That's beautiful, man. All right, so you talked about that. That's a good segue to the, I can't let you leave without a question on high-speed rail. So we got Brightline, or Orlando to Miami. I've covered them a lot. They're trying to do one out west. And you guys got Andy Byford here, who used to be, when I was at Baltimore, he was in Toronto, then New York, then London, then back here. Where are we at on high-speed rail for Amtrak? You guys are rolling on this, right?
Yeah, so, first off, we support, as I said, we believe in rail, and we believe that rail can and should do more as part of mobility in the U.S. So we support all the different folks who are out there trying to make stuff happen. So we support Brightline, and we support the work they're doing there at Cascadia and the Pacific Northwest.
Right.
This is all from our perspective. I think there's opportunity to try and get as much collective value by making sure a network works in the end so that people can use all these different systems and services together. Because I think that's really important and is something you see all over the world.
Right, like you're not going to build one right next to the Brightline train.
Exactly, right? So the question is, how do we, I think Amtrak's question is always, well, how do we create value for the American people, right? We're not here to make a dividend for the Treasury.
Right.
We're here to create value.
You're not the Sovereign Wealth Fund?
Okay. No,
we won't get into that. Never mind.
And obviously we want to do that with as little federal support as we can. We want to be able to earn as much as we can and invest, create as much independent financial capacity through our partners and through our own activities. But, I think our responsibility is, for all those taxpayers out there, how are we creating some value?
Yeah.
And so, we see all these different projects. We say, okay, how can we support? Is there ways for us to plug in to help? We're open to all that. And so we're excited by that. Andy is responsible really for our strategy about those opportunities. And he's leading our work in Texas, where we're
tell us
looking
about
at the
that.
specific project there. There's this long-term project that had been developed by Texas Central, and we're just
Houston to Dallas.
Houston to Dallas, an incredible, two incredible markets.
Yeah, man.
Like 13 million people between the two, and you look at Texas.
It's perfect.
It's like almost 10% of the U.S. population. It's
Yeah.
growing, hand over fist. I mean, it's really a huge success story, and we think rail makes so much sense. You're just going to run out of. The costs of highway construction there is enormous. Every lane you add is just already filled by the time it's built. You know the story, right?
Yeah.
So, and there's so much growth and so much opportunity. How do you efficiently support it? So we think that there's a really, really interesting case. There's been a lot of work done. What we're doing now is looking at all that work done in the past, trying to evaluate, what's the possibility of advancing that program. There are a lot of partners who have been involved, and we're, in conversations with all those. But the idea is that, hey, high speed is not. It's not some newfangled thing. It's 50 years old in Japan.
Yeah.
It's all over the world. China has incredible, massive network. Obviously, people are familiar in Europe, and we can do it here. The question is, in what markets and with what model? It's going to take some kind of partnerships.
Maglev versus regular rail, those kind of things.
Exactly. Those are interesting conversations. I think the thing that we believe is that high speed should be part of our mobility system, that it fits in with the conventional network. Everywhere in the world, there's high speed, there's a conventional network, and there's a transit network that support it, right? You've got to get to the station, and to go fast, you can't stop everywhere. That's the whole thing, right?
Yeah,
You cannot stop everywhere. So you need a way to collector system, a feeder system that gets people to those key high-speed nodes. And this is how things work together and how you really create options for people. And so we have that broad vision. We think high speed should be part of the equation. We're really lucky to have somebody like Andy with his incredible track record and skill to be leading that front for us. And we're going to be working with obviously the new administration and Congress to see what appetite there is and what opportunities, and then also with the private sector and with our states and localities, about what everyone wants to do here. But we think it's worth really understanding the opportunity and being able to give our own assessment about what we think is possible, and then we'll see where that leads us.
All right, so we're almost at time. I'd talk to you for like 2 hours, I think, but we don't have that much time. So what else you want to wrap us up with, and any other big projects you want to tell us about?
Yeah, well, so really, if you think about all the big projects, they kind of go into two big categories.
Okay.
One is replacing all our old stuff, right? As I said, we inherited all this stuff sort of from the older days before Amtrak was in existence, and then our first decade or two, we bought a bunch of new stuff. We're now kind of at the end of the useful life of all of those things, or things that need a lot of work. So there's a huge fleet program. We have our new Acela coming soon.
Yeah, man.
We have our new Aero trains coming to replace our regional sets. Those will be the first you'll see those are out in the Cascades in the Pacific Northwest in 2026, and then showing up on the Northeast Corridor and some of our state-supported routes in 2027. That's huge. I mean, that's really a generational upgrade in new equipment. These are all digital assets replacing analog assets. So they're much more sophisticated. I think they're going to be great. And then we've got new diesel locomotives already underway, and we are in the process of our solicitation to begin the long-distance train refleet. So over the next 10 years, we will basically retire the old fleet and come up with a whole new fleet. It's like a new generation, a new 21st century generation of these assets. So that's really exciting. We're also focused on how we get some more capacity into that mix, because the federal government has basically funded us to replace what we have, but not necessarily grow.
Yeah.
And as I said, we're already ahead of where we were planning for this year. Last year we set a record. This year, after the first quarter, our Northeast Corridor in December was 20% above the prior December in terms of ridership.
Big growth.
And we created a lot more capacity by running our assets harder. Now, that's tough because our assets are old, as I mentioned. So we're like putting them under a lot of strain, and they're showing their age. So there's a little bit of reliability issues that come with that. But there are so many people who want to take the train. We're just trying to get every seat we can out in the market. Meanwhile, get this new equipment in. And we've got a whole suite of work on stations, trying to update particularly our big stations, which had a lot of deferred work, doing that in partnership with developers and private parties to get great facilities in these communities. Also making accessible all over the network our facilities so that folks can have access to the train, so important. And then we're looking at some of our big key facilities like Chicago, where we have a ton of work at the station there, and also our maintenance facilities, Seattle, New Orleans, places we're building new capacity to handle the new fleet. Because it's one thing to buy new trains, but these new trains are digital, they're train sets, they need now upgraded facilities to be able to maintain them reliably. So it's kind of in every direction, we are really redesigning and reinventing the network. And we're doing it all at once. Not easy to try and manage all that.
There's a movie, Doing Everything All at Once or something like that. Right?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
what you're doing now.
Yeah. So we're trying to do it all at once. I mean, that gives us a lot of opportunities for synergy, but it also has a lot of complexity.
Oh, yeah.
And then, so sort of replacing all the old stuff is kind of category one for a new generation.
Okay.
And then category two is let's expand the network.
Yeah.
Let's grow into those places where, we barely serve, but we should. I think my heart goes out to places like Salt Lake City or Cleveland where, we have trains, but they come in the middle of the night. Or Little Rock, like I mentioned, right?
Yeah.
Like these are places that deserve good, high quality, regular service.
Right.
If they had it, I think you'd see real response, but we haven't been able to do that yet. And so we're partnering with states and communities are taking the lead through an FRA program called the Corridor Development Program, Corridor Identification Development, where sort of adding new opportunities on the map and starting the planning process to make those happen. And we think we think we need to extend the network. The network needs to grow to follow the population. We've added 130 million people since Amtrak was formed, and yet our network is still basically the same. So that means we've essentially been shrinking, as population's been growing and we haven't grown at the same rate, right? So I really think there's a lot more to do. Our state partners are the leaders here with FRA and sort of defining the opportunities, and then we're helping people kind of focus in on what's possible and the technical work to get there. But I think it's really exciting. A great example of this is our Borealis service. This is the new train that runs from Chicago to Milwaukee up to St. Paul. And it was an extension of a train that just went to Milwaukee, and then Minnesota joined in, and we were able to extend this train to St. Paul. And it's on the same route as the Empire Builder. And what it's done, Chicago-St. Paul was a very popular portion of the Empire Builder. People don't realize those long-distance trains, very few people, 10% or so, actually ride end-to-end. The vast majority of the riders are on segments between. And this is one of those really dominant segments on the Empire Builder. But because there was only one train a day, it wasn't so useful because you wanted to go, but you couldn't come back, or the train heading east was delayed because it was 2,000 miles before it got to St. Paul. So we added this train on top, so different time of day, but on that same route. It's been gangbusters, great results, far exceeding our own kind of analysis of what the demand would be. And I think it just goes to show when you create some utility with what in the airlines they call schedule utility, but just generally when you create enough options that people feel like they have choices and they could pick train A or train B depending on what they want to do that day, you really get a lot of response. So it's a proof point that when we build it in the right market with the right service pattern, we can see growth. The next thing coming up is our Gulf Coast service. This is Mobile to New Orleans. We've been working on that forever. We're finally, near the finish line sometime in 2025, and that's a whole new market for us since we stopped serving it way back in the hurricane, in Katrina. So it's a really important test for sort of a new market and a new service, and I'm hopeful it's going to be gangbusters with our new support, partners in Mobile and in Mississippi and Louisiana. So that's going to be really exciting, and we'll see how it goes this summer. But I think hopefully it's a prelude of more to come. Serve more of America, get to Phoenix, get to Nashville, get more than one train a day in Atlanta. You look at these places and you say, well, of course there's got to be a bunch of trains here, right? And you say, oh my God, how can there only be one? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. So, well, I'm very excited about what's your plans and what's happening, and I certainly hope that Congress sees the value of that and gives you the investment that they've been giving you over the last few years, and we continue that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we'll obviously be working hard. It's it's our responsibility to explain the value and what we're doing with the dollars. I feel good about what we've accomplished, but a lot more to do, and that's our all our partners. We're not a unitary actor. We do this in partnership with various host railroads and our suppliers and our state partners and our commuter partners. So we all have to kind of talk about, hey, this industry is creating incredible American jobs. You know, it really is. Our growth of employment, all the manufacturers who are out there building stuff, and the demand for concrete and steel and copper. I mean, just huge opportunities.
Oh, yeah.
And so that's creating real value. And then, you know, the end result creates value. We're creating mobility and economic opportunity. And so we think we got a great story.
You do. Thanks for telling it here today on Transit Unplugged.
It's my pleasure. Appreciate it, really.